The Young and the Restless spoilers. The story surrounding Noah's condition was growing more complicated and terrifying by the hour. His accident had left him in critical condition, and although his life had been spared, the damage was severe. Nick and Sharon, barely holding it together, watched as their son lay unconscious in the hospital, his head tightly bandaged, and his eyes obscured by the effects of the trauma. The doctor had been frank with them: the situation is unpredictable. We can't know for sure what kind of damage he's sustained until he wakes up. We can only wait. But that was easier said than done. The pain and uncertainty were too overwhelming to ignore. Every moment that passed felt like a lifetime, and the longer Noah remained unresponsive, the harder it was for Sharon and Nick to cling to hope. The hours dragged on, filled with silence and unspoken fears, until the doctors offered an answer that no one had expected: Noah had lost his memory. This revelation was as devastating as the accident itself. Noah couldn't remember anything. He didn't know who he was, who his parents were, or the lives he had once led. It was as if the accident had erased all the connections, all the people he had known, and all the history that made him Noah. His mind had become a blank slate, disconnected from everything that had defined him before. Sharon, in particular, was beside herself with grief. How could this happen to her son? How could he lose everything so abruptly? The loss wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a much deeper wound. Nick tried to hold it together for both of them, but it was clear that this was a battle they were not prepared to fight. Their son was still there, still breathing, but the Noah they knew, the Noah who had memories of his life, of them, of his friends and his past, was gone. That Noah might never return. But there was another layer to the mystery, one that only deepened their dread. Noah's memory loss wasn't just a result of trauma, it was a symptom of something more sinister. Sharon and Nick had no way of knowing this at first, but an anonymous source had sent them a chilling piece of information: Noah's memory loss wasn't just a natural consequence of a brain injury. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase his past. It was as if someone had intentionally wiped his memories clean, leaving him defenseless and vulnerable, unable to recognize friend from foe. The possibility that Noah had been targeted and silenced in this way left them horrified. The worst part of it all was that Noah, now without the ability to recall his past, could no longer be the key to unraveling the mystery of his accident. The one person who could identify who had hurt him, who could potentially lead them to the truth, was now the very person who had forgotten everything. The clock was ticking, and with every passing hour, the chances of finding answers seemed to slip further out of reach. If Noah didn't remember who had done this to him, how could anyone else figure it out? The investigation, which had once seemed so hopeful, was now at a standstill. Sharon clung to the belief that somehow, Noah's memory might return, that with time, he might remember fragments, pieces of the puzzle that would point them in the right direction. But even that hope felt fragile, as if it were slipping through their fingers. The doctors couldn't make any promises, and Noah's confusion seemed to only grow. He didn't recognize his own reflection, couldn't connect the faces around him to the life he once had. Sharon and Nick were forced to reintroduce themselves, explaining over and over again who they were, who he was, and trying to help him reconnect with the world he had forgotten. But every time they tried, it felt like they were starting from scratch. And then there was the chilling thought that crept in: what if Noah would never remember? What if the damage was permanent, not just to his mind but to their entire understanding of what had happened? What if the one person who had known the truth about who hurt him, and why, was now a stranger to himself? As Noah drifted in and out of sleep, the room grew colder with the weight of their helplessness. The clues were all there, but they were locked away in his fractured mind, a mind that might never be able to access them again. Sharon and Nick knew this wasn't just about their son's recovery, it was about everything that had been left behind, every unanswered question that had led to the accident, every suspect who had remained in the shadows. The key to it all was Noah, but he couldn't remember, and now, neither could they. The journey ahead would be one of slow, painful uncertainty, with only fragments of hope to guide them. The sterile white walls of the hospital room felt suffocating, but to Noah, they were alien. every sound, every voice, seemed detached from reality, as though the world had been muted and replaced with something unfamiliar. He blinked beneath the heavy bandages encasing his head, struggling to process even the simplest shapes, the faint hum of machinery, the beeping of monitors that tracked the fragile line between life and death. When two figures approached the bedside, tentative and wary, his gaze sharpened, not with recognition, but with bewildered curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse and trembling. The words, though soft, carried the weight of a chasm that had formed in his mind, a chasm where memory had once been. He didn't recognize them, didn't recognize the urgency in their eyes, the desperate hope that he would remember. These were his parents, Nick and Sharon, yet to Noah, they were strangers, adults claiming a relationship he could no longer understand. Nick's heart clenched painfully as the words struck him. He tried to swallow the rising panic, to maintain composure for the sake of the fragile boy who had once been his son. Sharon's eyes were wide with disbelief and terror, her hands trembling as she reached toward him, desperate to convey a sense of familiarity, a tether to the world Noah had lost. But Noah recoiled instinctively, confusion etching deeper lines into his young face. His brain, battered and bruised from the accident, couldn't process the faces, couldn't attach the names they offered to the child he had been or the man he was becoming. Every memory had been erased, wiped clean like a chalkboard, leaving nothing but emptiness and a cold void where identity had once lived. The doctor, standing nearby with a clipboard held tightly in his hands, intervened with clinical authority and a voice edged with concern. He explained gently, yet firmly, that any sudden display of emotion or insistence on recognition could worsen Noah's fragile state. The injury to his brain had created a temporary, but potentially long-lasting, amnesia, and stress could trigger seizures, panic, or even a decline in his vital signs. "Please step outside," the doctor instructed Nick and Sharon, his tone soft but resolute. "He doesn't understand. You need to give him space." Pressuring him now could make the situation far worse. Reluctantly, they obeyed, stepping into the cold hospital corridor, hearts aching with helplessness, leaving Noah to drift in the strange isolation of his own mind. But the corridors of the hospital, pristine and controlled as they seemed, were not free from danger. Unseen by the staff, shadowy figures lingered beyond the reach of security cameras, eyes glinting with malevolent intent. These were not random intruders. They were calculating, patient, and ruthless, aware that Noah was the living repository of a secret that could destroy them. The accident had not been an accident. It had been orchestrated with meticulous care, designed not merely to injure, but to erase the witness capable of exposing the truth. They had underestimated the resilience of the human mind, but not for long. Noah might remember, if only fragments of consciousness could pierce the fog of trauma. That possibility, however slight, was enough to make them desperate, enough to make them ruthless. They would not allow him to regain clarity. They could not. The truth was a weapon they had long wielded, and if it surfaced, it could ruin everything, their reputations, their freedom, their carefully curated facades. Noah lay in a haze of confusion, the steady beeping of the monitors becoming a rhythmic echo in his skull. Names, faces, and events blurred together, elusive and tantalizing. He had flashes, fleeting, incoherent visions of a day before the crash, a sense of danger, an instinctive understanding that someone had caused this. The thought was accompanied by fear, yet a glimmer of clarity shimmered beneath the veil of amnesia. Somewhere deep in his mind, the answer waited, a name, a face, the revelation of who had sought to harm him. But the memory was trapped behind walls of pain, trauma, and disorientation. He could sense its presence without grasping its form, like reaching for an object hidden in the dark. Outside, Nick and Sharon fought against their despair. Each passing second was a reminder of the fragile thread upon which Noah's life, and the secret he carried, was suspended. They whispered to one another in hushed tones, hearts pounding with a mixture of grief, fear, and determination. Every possible outcome ran through their minds, each more horrifying than the last. How could they protect their son when he could not recognize them? How could they shield him from the predators lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment of vulnerability to strike. The hospital, designed as a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a labyrinth of threats, both known and unseen, a battlefield where every step could be fatal. Within Noah, a struggle raged silently. His consciousness flickered, unsure of what was real. Every voice, every shadow, became a potential threat or ally, indistinguishable from the fog that clouded his perception. The hospital lights seemed too bright, the beeping too sharp, the silence too loud. Somewhere beneath the surface, instincts began to coalesce. His body remembered movements before his mind remembered the meaning of names. He flinched at shadows, tensed at the approach of strangers, felt protective of spaces that he could not yet define. Deep within, there was a primal awareness that danger existed, that someone had tried to silence him, and that survival depended not on memory alone, but on vigilance, on sensing threat, on listening to the unspoken cues of the world around him. The predators waited patiently, their patience fueled by cruelty and fear. They had meticulously studied the patterns of the hospital, anticipated the routines of staff, and calculated the exact moment when Noah's vulnerability would be at its peak. Each heartbeat of their prey was a countdown to potential disaster. Yet even as they poised to act, there was the lingering, unacknowledged truth: memory is resilient. The brain, though damaged, often holds onto fragments of truth, storing them in places beyond conscious access, where recognition and instinct intertwine. It was in these hidden corners of Noah's mind that the name, the face of the person responsible for his near-death, waited to surface. Within the sterile room, as monitors recorded every pulse, every shallow breath, Noah's mind began to reach, subconsciously probing the void. Flickers of images surfaced, blurred but charged with emotion: a hand, a car, an argument, the sensation of impact, fear, anger. There was a presence, an antagonist, looming in his peripheral vision, even in his memory, a person whose motives he did not yet understand. And with it came fragments of recognition, unformed but potent. This was not random. This was intentional. Someone wanted him gone. Someone had caused this. His instincts, honed by survival, screamed a warning that he could not yet articulate. Meanwhile, Sharon and Nick paced in the corridor, each minute stretching like an eternity. They were trapped in a paradoxical state, unable to comfort their son, yet unwilling to leave him entirely. Every nurse who passed, every doctor who adjusted the monitors, became a potential ally or unwitting observer of the greater danger. The fear of unseen watchers pressed on them like a tangible weight. The realization that someone, somewhere, was actively working against Noah, plotting to finish what the accident had begun, was almost unbearable. These were not ordinary criminals. They were calculated, cold, and willing to kill to preserve their secrets. Every sound, every movement, every glance from strangers in the hallway could be the precursor to violence. Inside, Noah's consciousness flickered again. A fragment of memory surfaced, accompanied by a jolt of panic. He saw a face, not clear but charged with malevolence. He heard a voice, muffled but accusing, repeating something like a name. His lips parted, a whisper forming, though the sound was lost to the sterile hum of machinery, the first indication that the truth was trying to break through. His mind, despite trauma, despite amnesia, was beginning to form connections. The attacker, the orchestrator of his suffering, was somewhere in his recollections. If he could only hold on to it, if he could only grasp that fragment, perhaps justice, or at least the path to answers, could survive. Outside, Nick and Sharon, unaware of these flickers, leaned against the walls, numb but determined. They whispered fervent prayers, not for memory to return fully, but for the sparks to ignite, for the pieces to align long enough to name the person who had tried to destroy their son. They feared it might never come, feared the predators lurking unseen, feared the fragile veil of hospital security could not protect him from those willing to kill. And yet, in the silent rhythm of Noah's breathing, in the faint flutter of his fingers as he shifted beneath the bandages, there was a stubborn pulse of hope, that Noah would remember, that he would find the courage to speak the name that would unravel the lies and confront the darkness threatening him. The hospital, so often a sanctuary, had become a crucible. Every second Noah lay in his fractured state, every second the predators waited, was a test of endurance, of instinct, of resilience. And Noah, though he did not yet recognize the faces of Nick and Sharon, though he could not yet articulate the horrors inflicted upon him, was alive, and somewhere within, the key to justice remained. The name that could expose the orchestrator of his suffering, that could shine light on the shadows stalking him, lay dormant, but it had not vanished. All that remained was the question of whether Noah, with his mind battered but not broken, would reclaim it, and whether the world, cruel and merciless, would be ready to hear it when he did.